The Black Death already has one of the most terrifying names in history, but what the plague did in real life makes almost every video game villain out there seem like a Sunday morning cartoon. Resonance, A Plague Tale Legacy, comes out soon, but as we learned from the first two games, the Bubonic Plague itself is, in a way, just like it was in real life, its own character, constantly antagonizing not just our main characters, but humanity as a whole. But where did this thing come from? What biological terror did it unleash on people, and ultimately what became of the Black Death? Would you be horrified to know that the plague is still among us? It's this microscopic bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, and the first thing you have to understand is that it doesn't actually want anything to do with humans, like genuinely at all. We are not its target audience. If Yersinia pestis was a developer, humans would not even be on its roadmap. Its actual, natural home is wild rodents. Marmots and ground squirrels mostly, plus a bunch of other little fuzzy guys that live in burrows in the dirt like gerbils and voles. And these rodent colonies are scattered across Central Asia, parts of Africa, the western US, and a bunch of other places that you would not necessarily expect them to be. The bacterium just chills inside of those rodent populations, hopping from one animal to the next, using fleas as the delivery method. And this has been going on in the background of nature for thousands of years without any disturbances amongst the humans. Genetic analysis says that Yersinia pestis evolved around 7,000 years ago, way back at the beginning of what historians call the Neolithic period. That's basically when humans first started farming. The specific flea-transmitted strains we associate with the bubonic plague showed up later, closer to about 3,800 years ago during the Late Bronze Age. So this thing has been cycling through wild animals since before written history even existed. The way that it actually jumps from rats to people is through a very specific type of flea called the Oriental rat flea. Scientific name Xenocella chiopis if you want to flex at parties. When one of these fleas bites an infected rat, the plague bacteria multiply inside of the flea's gut and form this thick, gooey biofilm that physically blocks up its digestive tract, specifically the part of the gut called the proventriculus. So the flea is trying to drink blood, but it literally cannot swallow anymore, which means the flea is starving to death while sitting on top of a host with its mouth full of plague bacteria. And I'm just getting like chills on my neck just like thinking about how disgusting that looks. A starving flea is an extremely motivated flea. The desperate little guy keeps biting and biting and biting, trying to get a meal in, but every time it bites, it ends up regurgitating thousands of plague bacteria right into the bite wound. The flea has basically become this tiny living syringe spraying contagion into whatever it touches. Other rats, humans, your dog, your cat, it does not care. It does not discriminate at all. That is the delivery system, and once the Yersinia pestis gets inside of a human host, it can take one of 3 different forms, depending on where it set up shop, and each one is worse than the last. The most common version is the one that most people have heard of, which is the bubonic plague. The bacteria travel through your lymphatic system, which is basically your body's drainage network, and then they camp out in the nearest lymph node where they multiply like crazy and cause these enormous swollen lumps called bubobes. They show up in your groin, your armpits, your neck, and they hurt a lot more than your average swollen gland. There was an Italian writer named Giovanni Boccaccio who actually lived through the bubonic plague in Florence in 1348, and he described the bubobes as starting out about the size of an egg and sometimes growing as big as a common apple. You would also get high fevers, brutal headaches, chills, and the kind of weakness where you literally can't stand up because you don't have the energy to. The World Health Organization puts the untreated mortality rate of the bubonic plague between 30 to 60%, and to give you a sense of how nuts that number is, COVID-19, which I'm sure a lot of us remember, had a case fatality rate of around 1 to nearly 3%. Again, the bubonic plague, 30 to 60%. COVID-19, 1 to 3%. Now, the second form of the pestis yersinia is the pneumonic plague, and it is what happens when the bacteria settle into your lungs instead of your lymph nodes. The reason that this version is so terrifying is that it can spread person to person through air, like a regular respiratory illness. Somebody coughs and breathes in your direction, boom, you got it. And the symptoms come stupid fast. Sometimes inside of a single day of exposure, you get high fever, your chest starts to hurt, breathing gets difficult, and then you start coughing up bloody mucus. The untreated mortality rate is well above 90%. In a medieval world where antibiotics didn't exist, this was basically a guaranteed death sentence. But then you have the third form, septicemic plague, which is the rarest of the three and easily the most gruesome of them all. This is what happens when the bacteria get directly into your bloodstream and multiply so rapidly that your entire body collapses into systemic shock before any of the other symptoms can even develop. Your blood starts clotting inside tiny vessels all over your body, which is a condition called disseminated intravascular coagulation. Your fingers, your toes, tip of your nose, they all start dying from lack of blood flow, and they turn black. Untreated, basically 100% fatality rate. The blackening of extremities is actually one of the reasons that some historians think the name Black Death eventually stuck to the whole identity of the pandemic centuries later. But the real story of where that name came from is actually way more interesting than just that, and I'm saving it for the end of the video, so stick around for that. Here is the wild thing. For most of human history, nobody had a clue what was actually causing any of this. People had theories, and the theories were wildly wrong. The mystery actually did not get cracked until the 1890s during what historians call the Third Plague Pandemic. There was this Swiss-French bacteriologist named Alexandre Yersin, and in 1894 he got sent to Hong Kong to deal with an outbreak. He landed on the 5th of June that year. Quick little fun detail, the British colonial authorities running Hong Kong at the time, again 1894, would not let him work in any of their hospitals because he was French and they were doing the whole rivalry thing. So Yersin set up a shop in a straw hut that he built outside of one of the hospitals. In about 2 weeks, working out of that hut alone, with basically nothing, he isolated the bacterium responsible for the disease that had killed hundreds of millions of people across human history. One guy, working alone, in a hut, for 2 weeks, about 2 weeks, and just like that, the case was basically closed. And so they named the bacterium Yersinia pestis in his honor, which I think is a pretty fair trade, to get a bacteria named after you, your last name. But there was still a lot to learn. 4 years later, 1898, another researcher named Paul Louis Simond, working in Karachi, proved the flea transmission piece of the puzzle through a really clean experiment. He showed that a healthy rat kept in a cage near a sick rat, where they could not touch each other but the fleas could move between them, would still catch the plague. So the fleas were the ones doing the work. You would think that, this guy figured out how the plague actually spreads, but back then, at first, the scientific community didn't believe him. They did not believe Paul. They thought it was preposterous, crazy. His findings did not get widely accepted until around 1905 to 1906. But dude was right the whole time. Alright, time to talk about where this whole nightmare actually started. For centuries, this was hotly debated by historians and scientists. Theories about where the first break happened ranged from China to the Middle East to basically anywhere on the map that was conveniently far away from wherever this person was making the guess happened to live. And then in 2022, the case basically got cracked open thanks to modern science. Researchers studying a medieval cemetery in modern-day Kyrgyzstan noticed something unusual. In 1338 and 1339, there was a massive spike in burials, and several tombstones blamed the deaths on some kind of pestilence. So, they tested DNA taken from the teeth of people buried there, and they found Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. However, the really important part was the strain that they found. Genetically, it sits right near the point where Yersinia pestis split into the major branches that would later spread across Eurasia. In other words, researchers had found an extremely close ancestor of the strain responsible for the Black Death, killing people in Central Asia in 1338. But the location makes the discovery even more convincing. Closely related plague strains are still found in marmot populations living around the same region to this day. And yet there's more, because this area also sat directly along the Silk Road. Now, Under the Mongols, trade across Eurasia had become faster, safer, and more interconnected than ever before. You had merchants, caravans, travelers, and animals moving enormous distances across a network that stretched from Central Asia towards Europe. And without realizing it, they had essentially built a fast travel system for a pathogen. I do want to be careful here because this does not completely settle where the plague itself first originated from. Everybody thought for a long time that it originated in China, while other researchers have proposed different parts of Asia or even multiple plague strains spreading at once. But the evidence in Kyrgyzstan gives us something much more concrete. People dying from an ancestral Black Plague strain in Central Asia in 1338, right beside one of the biggest trade networks on the planet, only a few years before the pandemic devastated Europe. Once the plague was established in Central Asia, it began moving west along the trade routes, and by 1346 it had reached the Black Sea and a major European trading colony that was under siege by a Mongol army. Then the plague broke out among the soldiers. One medieval account claims the besieging army responded by catapulting infected corpses over city walls, potentially making this an early example of biological warfare. Except that story is disputed and the writer was not actually there. Either way, what ended up happening was merchants eventually fled the city by ship and the plague went along with them. By 1347, it had reached Constantinople, one of the largest cities in the world, where even the emperor's young son died, and from there the infected ships carried the disease deeper into the Mediterranean. That same October, ships would arrive in Sicily filled with dead and dying soldiers. Now, authorities quickly drove them away, but it was already too late. So, refugees fled to neighboring cities where initially the people over there refused to take them in out of fear of infection. However, those cities were soon overwhelmed too. And this is where the speed of the disease becomes terrifying. One account describes a sick refugee being taken in by an old friend. Within days, that refugee was dead. By the end of the week, so was his friend, his household, and many of the people living nearby. You see, one act of kindness was enough to introduce the plague into an entirely new community, decimating them. Writers from the time described families being torn apart in the same ways. Parents begged children not to abandon them. Husbands and wives called to each other from across rooms because getting close enough to offer comfort could mean dying alongside them. But to be honest with you, if it was my wife, fuck it, I'm dying with her too because I love her and I'd rather be dead with her than to be alive without her. By early 1348, infected ships had reached major ports across Italy and France, and from there the plague spread into Spain, Portugal, England, then through Germany, Scotland, Scandinavia, and then Eastern Europe. Within only a few years, almost the entire continent had been infested. The entire continent. While Europe was getting eaten alive, the Middle East and North Africa were going through their own apocalypse at the exact same time. We don't talk about this part of the story enough, and it is just as brutal. Autumn 1347, plague reaches Alexandria in Egypt, carried by a single merchant ship from Constantinople. One ship was all it took. The disease moved up the Nile River, and by late summer of 1348, it had hit Cairo. At the time, Cairo was the largest city in the entire Mediterranean basin with a population of about 600,000 people. The young sultan of the city fled, and within about 8 months, more than a third of its population was dead. The Nile River was flooded with dead bodies. What makes this case especially striking is that Cairo, at the time, had one of the most advanced hospitals in the medieval world. It was centuries ahead of many European medical institutions. But against the plague, it just didn't matter. There were so many bodies that gravediggers and funeral workers would not be able to keep up. And what's worse is that this was not a one-time disaster. The plague would keep coming back to Cairo dozens of times over the next century and a half, meaning entire generations grew up knowing that this could come back. 1348, infected pilgrims carried the disease to Mecca during the Hajj, one of the largest annual gatherings in the world. From there, plague spread through major cities across the Middle East. It also reached North Africa by ship. When an army besieging Tunis was struck by plague, the soldiers scattered and unknowingly carried it back home with them. Across the Middle East, the Black Death ultimately killed about a third of the population. Okay, I want to talk numbers here, but I want to warn you guys up front that the numbers attached to this thing are pretty much impossible to really comprehend, to actually process. Your brain will just skitter right off of them. The Black Plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in 7 years. That works out to roughly about 25 to 50 million Europeans dead. It killed a third of the Middle East at the same time. Worldwide, it reduced the entire human population, which was about 475 million people at the time, down to somewhere between 350 to 375 million human beings left. If half the people in your country died over the next 7 years, that is an apocalypse on a scale that we cannot conceptualize today. Every other person that you know would be gone in the span of a few months. The friends you grew up with, your immediate family, your coworkers, the random stranger that you made eye contact with on the train, half of them dead. Thanos just snapped. And we could talk numbers from Norway to Germany to England, Florence. We could talk about how half of Paris perished. But honestly, numbers can only get you so far with something like this. So I want to read you guys a passage that genuinely hit me hard when I was researching this video. There was an Italian chronicler named Agnolo di Tura who lived in the city of Siena. He was a shoemaker. He worked part-time tax collector. He buried 5 children with his own hands during the plague, and he wrote down what it was like. Quote, "Father, abandoned child. Wife, husband. One brother, another. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best as they could, without priests, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of the dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night, and as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died, that all believed it was the end of the world." End quote. I love my wife, and I can't picture what it would be like to have to bury her with my own hands and not even be allowed to mourn them properly because everybody around me was either dying or already dead. There was a pilgrim returning home through a town called Salvatierra in Galicia, which is northern Spain. Only 1 in 10 people in the town had survived the outbreak. The pilgrim and his companion stayed the night at an inn and ate dinner with the host, who had somehow survived all along with his 2 daughters and 1 servant. They paid for the meal and went to bed. But when they woke up in the morning to leave, they couldn't find anybody. But they eventually found one old woman in the town who told them that the host, both of his daughters, and the servants all died in the night. That is what the Black Death looked like. You sat down for dinner with somebody, and you would wake up and they were dead. Medieval medicine was completely outclassed by the plague. Most physicians believed that disease spread through corrupted or foul-smelling air, so people were told to burn herbs, perfumes, and fires to purify the atmosphere around them. Pope Clement VI famously surrounded himself with huge fires in an attempt to stay safe, which is honestly kind of a mood. Other treatments included bloodletting and cutting open swollen pubobes to drain them, which usually was useless or it made things worse. But the best example of just how little anybody understood comes from 1348, when the King of France asked some of the country's leading medical experts to explain what was happening. And their official conclusion was that the plague had been caused by an alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, which had corrupted the air and poisoned everybody breathing it. That wasn't some fringe superstition, by the way. That was essentially the best medical explanation some of Europe's most educated physicians could come up with at the time. Okay, so how can you talk about this plague and not mention the famous beaked plague doctor mask, the one stuffed with herbs, aromatic oils that shows up in every single movie and game, and Halloween costume about the Black Death? That is not actually from the 14th century. Did you know that? That beaked design got invented in the early 17th century, 1619, and it's associated with a French physician named Charles de Lorme. So, the doctors who were treating patients with the plague in 1348 were not running around in those creepy bird masks. The whole look was about 300 years late to the party, but I do see it in a lot of Black Death-related media, and it's wrong every single time. Make note of that. You are now insufferable at dinner parties. Welcome to my world. A lot of people at the time understood the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins, and out of that fear came one of the strangest, most bizarre religious movements of the period, the Flagellants. These were a group of men who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with leather straps, sometimes tipped with metal, believing that their suffering might convince God to end the plague. Yeah, you know what I mean? The movement exploded across Europe, but it also became increasingly radical. Some flagellant groups began blaming Jewish communities for the plague, spreading false claims that the Jews had poisoned wells. No evidence for that. Jewish communities were dying from the plague just like everybody else. Even the Pope publicly pointed this out and ordered the killings to stop. It did not stop. By the early 1350s, hundreds of Jewish communities across Europe had been attacked or destroyed, driving many survivors eastward. The plague was not only killing enormous numbers of people, fear was changing how people treated one another, sometimes with horrific consequences, but violence and scapegoating were only one response to a disaster that nobody understood. Another way that people tried to cope is something that sounds kind of familiar. You see, when the Black Plague happened, a lot of people locked themselves inside of their homes, avoided contact with everybody that they could, and tried to simply wait it all out. Others went in the opposite direction. If death could come at any moment, they decided that they might as well enjoy themselves while they still could, drinking, partying, and indulging in whatever they wanted to while the world fell apart around them. Their reactions, their human reactions, are very much recognizable today. Isolation, denial, partying, superstition, escape, blame, humor. People were trying anything that they could to make an incomprehensible horror feel survivable. But here's something kind of cool that came out of all this misery. The modern concept of quarantine got invented during the plague years. The Republic of Ragusa, which is the modern city of Dubrovnik in Croatia, implemented a formal 30-day isolation period in 1377 for anybody arriving from plague-infected areas. They would hold incoming travelers on nearby islands or at a small town for a full month before letting them into the city proper. But later this isolation period would get extended to 40 days. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta, which is where we get our modern English word quarantine. The economic ramifications of the Black Death reshaped Europe for generations because with so many people dead, there were suddenly not enough workers to farm the land, make goods, or maintain estates, and that gave surviving peasants and artisans far more bargaining power than they ever had before, because now workers could demand higher wages, leave for another estate if they felt like they were being treated badly, and negotiate with landowners who desperately needed them, which put enormous pressure on the feudal system because that entire arrangement depended on a large population of workers with very few alternatives. As you would expect, the ruling class naturally tried to stop this. Governments passed laws freezing wages at pre-plague levels and restricting workers from moving around, but those laws were difficult to enforce and mostly created more resentment, and by the end of the century that frustration helped fuel major uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt in England. After watching so many people die, surviving workers were much less willing to accept poverty and obedience as simply their place in the world. The church was also being shaken at the same time, partly because priests, monks, and nuns were dying in huge numbers while caring for the sick, and partly because religious authorities had no real explanation for why the plague was happening and, as a result, no way to stop it. but that did not destroy religious faith. It did, however, contribute to a growing willingness to question institutions that had once seemed untouchable, and some historians see that erosion of authority as one of the many long-term conditions that later helped to make the Reformation possible. Meanwhile, the population started recovering surprisingly quickly. Birth rates began rising again within only a few years, and property that had once been divided between large families was now concentrated among fewer survivors, which meant a lot of people suddenly had more land and wealth than they ever would have expected before the plague. But contemporary writers were not especially impressed by what people did with that second chance. The survivors of the plague became greedier, more argumentative, and more obsessed with fighting over property. Lawsuits increased, wars continued, charity towards strangers did not suddenly flourish, and humanity basically went right back to being shit. Yep, as soon as they had the breathing room to do so. What's interesting is that all of these changes are parts of why some historians connect the Black Death to the later Renaissance period. With wealth concentrated among fewer survivors, old social hierarchies weakened, and people becoming more willing to question authority, Europe was gradually creating more room for new ideas about society, art, wealth, and human life. But here is the part that most people genuinely either have no idea about or forget about. The Black Death of 1346 to 1353 was not the end of the plague in Europe at all. It was actually just the opening first act of what the historians call the Second Plague pandemic. The Bubonic Plague didn't show up and then just leave. It kept coming back for over 300 years. Every single year for 325 years straight, there was an active plague outbreak going on somewhere in Europe. There was no clean break for anybody, just wave after wave for generations of human beings who never once got to know a world without this disease. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was one of the last major outbreaks of the period. Official records say that about 68,000 people died during the outbreak, but the real number was probably closer to about 100,000, which meant roughly a quarter of London's entire population may have died. At its peak in September 1665, more than 7,000 plague deaths were being recorded in a single week, and even those numbers were probably low because the people responsible for counting the dead simply couldn't keep up with how many bodies were coming in. One of the most remarkable stories from that outbreak came from the village of Eyam, where the plague arrived and the residents of the village made an extraordinary decision. Rather than flee and risk carrying the disease into neighboring towns, the village voluntarily quarantined, and they knew that staying put could very well kill them, and yet they still did it. Out of roughly 350 people, about 257 died, but by remaining inside the village boundaries, they probably helped prevent the outbreak from spreading farther into the surrounding countrysides. So the question is, how did this finally end? Well, there was no miracle cure or vaccine. What made the biggest difference was bureaucracy, and I am dead serious about that. By the 1500s, Italian cities that had been dealing with the recurring outbreaks for generations started building organized public health systems around them. They created dedicated plague hospitals, established health boards with actual legal authority, inspected incoming ships, tracked outbreaks, and enforced quarantines and isolation orders, basically creating an early version of public health infrastructure that we would recognize today. Over the next century, those systems spread across Europe, and as governments became better at monitoring disease and controlling the movement of infected people and goods, plague outbreaks became harder to sustain. Western Europe saw fewer and fewer major epidemics through the 1600s until the strain responsible for the Black Plague eventually disappeared from the region entirely. So, after centuries of physicians cutting people open, burning herbs, self-flagellating, blaming planets, and the Jewish community praying for divine intervention, one of the things that finally helped push the plague out of Western Europe was paperwork. Gotta give it to geography too. Geography helped. Some places were able to escape the Black Death simply because they were isolated from the rest of the world. especially in this medieval world, this medieval Europe where everybody was deeply connected. And centuries later, controlling that movement became one of the main ways Europeans finally learned how to contain it. But even as you're watching this right now, the plague is still among us. The bacterium lives in rodent populations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, the Congo, Madagascar, Peru. Good news, we have modern medicine, so mortality rates drop to about 11%. Bad news is that the existence of drug-resistant strains of this bacterium means that we cannot, as humanity, afford to think of this as a problem that we've already solved and moved on from. One more quick and cool, interesting piece of information about this. Nobody who lived through the Black Death ever called it that. They called it the Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, or just Pestilence. All gnarly names either way. A bacterium smaller than a speck of dust, hitching a ride on a flea on the back of a rat tucked into the cargo hold of an Italian ship, took out half of a continent in 7 years. It killed kings, peasants, popes, beggars, with the total same indifference. It rewrote economics, religion, art, politics, and it is still out there right now doing its thing, waiting for the right conditions to take another shot at us. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know, and take care of yourselves out there. Love the people that you have in your life while you can. Maybe wash your hands a lot more than you do. And YouTube thinks you're going to like this video on the screen next, so let me know if YouTube was right.